There are moments in life when a relationship begins to feel heavier than peaceful, yet many people continue holding on because they fear loss more than suffering. This is especially true for empaths. Empaths naturally see potential in people. They focus on the good moments, the promises, the emotional connection, and the hope that things will eventually improve. They tolerate behavior others would walk away from because they believe love can heal brokenness. But there is a dangerous line between compassion and self-destruction. And when an empath becomes connected to a narcissist who is not part of their divine destiny, God eventually begins creating separation before the damage becomes permanent. At first, the empath may not understand what is happening. The relationship that once felt exciting suddenly becomes emotionally exhausting. Small disagreements turn into constant tension. Peace disappears. Confusion increases. The empath feels emotionally drained almost every day. What they once called love now feels like survival. Many people think this disturbance means they should try harder, pray harder, sacrifice more, or become even more understanding. But sometimes the disturbance is not a sign to fight for the relationship. Sometimes it is heaven's warning that the connection is spiritually unhealthy. God understands what the empath cannot always see clearly. He sees how the narcissist slowly destroys confidence through manipulation. He sees the emotional exhaustion caused by constant criticism, control, guilt, and confusion. He sees the silent suffering hidden behind forced smiles. Most importantly, he sees the future damage that will happen if the empath remains trapped in that environment for too long. That is why God often creates discomfort before destruction. He interrupts false peace before emotional collapse occurs. One of the most painful truths about toxic relationships is that people can become addicted to emotional cycles. The empath starts confusing temporary affection with genuine love. They become emotionally dependent on moments of validation. Even after being hurt repeatedly, they continue hoping the narcissist will change. But God will never allow his children to build their lives entirely around emotional imprisonment. So eventually he allows the relationship to lose the very thing that kept the empath attached: comfort. Suddenly conversations no longer feel safe. The narcissist's words begin affecting the empath more deeply. The emotional manipulation becomes easier to recognize. The empath feels restless inside. They may even feel convicted spiritually every time they ignore red flags. Why does this happen? Because God is awakening discernment. Before separation happens physically, it often happens spiritually and emotionally first. The empath begins sensing that something is deeply wrong even when they cannot explain it perfectly. Many empaths make the mistake of praying for the relationship to survive while ignoring the fact that the relationship is destroying their mental peace, identity, confidence, and spiritual growth. But God's priority is not merely preserving relationships. His priority is protecting purpose. If a relationship is pulling someone away from peace, wisdom, growth, truth, and emotional stability, God will eventually intervene. And his intervention often feels uncomfortable because attachment is being challenged. Sometimes God allows repeated conflict because he knows comfort would keep the empath trapped. If everything stayed temporarily peaceful, the empath might never leave. So heaven removes the illusion, the cycles become more obvious. The manipulation becomes impossible to ignore. The emotional exhaustion intensifies until the empath finally reaches a point where they can no longer pretend things are healthy. This is not cruelty from God. This is protection. You must understand something important. God will disturb what is destroying you when you refuse to release it voluntarily. Many people ask God for signs while ignoring the emotional chaos they experience daily. But loss of peace is often one of the clearest signs heaven gives. God never intended love to make someone lose themselves completely. Love should not require constant emotional suffering, fear, confusion, and self-abandonment. The empath often feels guilty during this process because they naturally want to help and heal others. They may think walking away means failure or selfishness. But there is a difference between helping someone and sacrificing your entire identity to maintain a toxic connection. God did not create the empath to become an emotional prisoner in someone else's dysfunction. He created them to live with peace, wisdom, purpose, and emotional freedom. As the separation process continues, the empath slowly realizes that the relationship was consuming their energy, distracting their focus, weakening their confidence, and draining their spirit. They begin noticing how much of their life revolved around managing another person's emotions instead of developing their own future. This realization is painful because it exposes how much of themselves they abandoned trying to keep the relationship alive. But this is where transformation begins. The disturbance that once felt frightening now becomes clarity. The separation that once felt painful now begins feeling necessary. The empath starts understanding that God was not trying to punish them by disrupting the relationship. He was trying to rescue them from years of deeper emotional destruction. What felt like heartbreak was actually divine interruption. And eventually, the empath reaches a powerful moment of awakening. They stop asking, wait, why is this relationship falling apart? And begin asking, why was I trying so hard to keep something alive that was slowly destroying me? That question changes everything. Because once God opens the eyes of an empath, they begin valuing peace more than unhealthy attachment. They begin choosing healing over chaos. And they finally realize that sometimes the greatest act of love God can give is separation before complete destruction occurs. One of the most painful experiences an empath can go through is realizing that the person they deeply loved was never truly operating from the same emotional depth, honesty, or compassion. In the beginning, narcissists often appear incredibly convincing. They know how to mirror emotions, create intense attachment, and present themselves as the answer to someone's loneliness, pain, or longing for connection. To an empath, this can feel spiritual, rare, and deeply meaningful. But when God determines that this relationship is not aligned with destiny, something begins to shift. The illusion starts cracking. The mask slowly falls. And the truth that was once hidden becomes impossible to ignore. At first, the empath usually resists this revelation. They make excuses. They explain away the toxic behavior. They focus on the narcissist's potential instead of their patterns. This happens because empaths naturally look for goodness in people. They believe love can heal wounds, patience can change behavior, and sacrifice can restore brokenness. But God understands something the empath often struggles to accept. You cannot heal someone who is committed to remaining destructive. You cannot save someone who feeds on control, manipulation, and emotional power. That is why God begins exposing the narcissist's true nature little by little. Not all at once, because sudden truth can sometimes overwhelm a person emotionally. Instead, patterns begin repeating. The empath notices contradictions. Promises are broken repeatedly. Manipulation becomes more obvious. The narcissist starts revealing anger whenever they lose control. Their kindness becomes conditional. Their affection becomes transactional. And eventually the empath begins asking painful questions they once avoided. Why do I always feel emotionally exhausted around this person? Why do I constantly feel guilty for expressing my needs? Why does every conversation turn into confusion, blame, or emotional punishment? Why am I the only one trying to repair the relationship? These questions are important because clarity is often the first step toward freedom. God allows the empath to see what emotions kept hiding. Sometimes love can blind people to danger. Emotional attachment can make dysfunction appear normal. The empath becomes so focused on preserving the relationship that they ignore the damage happening within themselves. They tolerate disrespect they would never advise others to accept. They silence their intuition. They lose confidence in their own perception of reality. This is where the narcissist's true character becomes fully exposed. Not because God suddenly changed them, but because God removed the emotional blindness that kept the empath trapped. The manipulation that once seemed subtle now becomes obvious. The gaslighting becomes undeniable. The emotional inconsistency becomes exhausting rather than exciting. The empath starts recognizing that what they called love was often control mixed with emotional dependency. One of the hardest truths for empaths to accept is that narcissists often study kindness in order to exploit it. They recognize compassion as a doorway to access emotional control. They understand how to trigger guilt, sympathy, and emotional responsibility. And because empaths naturally carry deep emotional sensitivity, they become vulnerable to this cycle. The narcissist learns that every time they apologize without changing, the empath will give another chance. Every time they create emotional chaos, the empath will work harder to restore peace. Every time they withdraw affection, the empath will chase validation. But God never intended for love to become emotional slavery. So when heaven decides this relationship cannot continue, exposure intensifies. The narcissist may become more aggressive, more distant, more manipulative, or more careless because unhealthy people often react negatively when they feel control slipping away. And strangely, this painful behavior becomes part of the awakening process. The empath begins seeing that the relationship survives only when they abandon themselves completely. They realize they have been sacrificing peace, dignity, and emotional stability just to keep another person comfortable. This realization hurts deeply because the empath mourns not only the relationship, but also the fantasy attached to it. They grieve the version of the narcissist they hoped existed. They grieve the future they imagined. They grieve the emotional investment they poured into someone who continuously drained them. But even in this heartbreak, God is working through truth, because deception can never lead someone into destiny. God exposes what is false before it destroys the future completely. He allows hidden motives to surface. He allows repeated pain to reveal dangerous patterns. He allows emotional discomfort to awaken spiritual discernment. What once felt confusing suddenly becomes clear. And though the truth may initially break the empath's heart, it ultimately protects their soul. The beautiful part of this painful process is that the empath slowly begins reconnecting with themselves again. They stop doubting their instincts. They stop carrying responsibility for another person's toxic behavior. They stop believing they must suffer endlessly to prove loyalty. Instead, they begin understanding that healthy love does not require constant emotional bleeding. And eventually, the empath realizes something life-changing. God was not trying to punish them by exposing the narcissist. He was trying to save them before they disappeared completely inside someone else's darkness. One of the most powerful things God does when an empath and a narcissist are not destined to remain together is that he begins separating the empath emotionally before the relationship physically ends. Most people think breakups happen suddenly, but spiritual separation often starts long before the final goodbye. God starts disconnecting the empath internally because he understands something the empath cannot yet fully see. You cannot continue carrying emotional chains and still walk into your divine future. At first, the empath does not recognize what is happening. They only notice that something inside them is changing. The attachment that once felt intense begins to weaken little by little. Conversations that once brought excitement now create exhaustion. The emotional highs no longer feel satisfying. The constant need to prove love, earn approval, or maintain peace starts becoming emotionally unbearable. This is not because the empath suddenly becomes cold-hearted. It is because God is awakening their spirit to the reality of the relationship. Many empaths stay trapped because they confuse emotional intensity with destiny. They believe that because they feel deeply connected, the relationship must be meant to last forever. But God does not measure relationships by emotional obsession. He measures them by purpose, peace, growth, and spiritual alignment. A narcissistic relationship often survives on emotional addiction rather than genuine love. The empath keeps hoping, fixing, forgiving, sacrificing, and waiting for change, while slowly losing their own identity in the process. But there comes a point where heaven says, enough is enough. God begins exposing the emotional imbalance to the empath. They start noticing that they are always the one carrying the emotional burden. They are the one apologizing first, understanding first, sacrificing first, and forgiving first. The relationship begins to feel like emotional labor instead of emotional partnership. The empath starts realizing they have spent so much time trying to heal someone else that they neglected their own wounds, dreams, peace, and identity. This emotional awakening can feel terrifying because empaths naturally fear disconnection. They often tie their worth to how much they can help, save, or support others. Even when they are being mistreated, they continue giving because they believe love means endurance. But God never intended love to become emotional slavery. He never designed relationships to destroy a person's confidence, mental peace, or spiritual health. So when the empath refuses to let go willingly, God slowly weakens the unhealthy emotional attachment from within. Suddenly, the empath no longer feels desperate for constant validation. The narcissist's approval starts losing its power. The manipulative cycles become easier to recognize. The guilt no longer controls them the same way. The empath begins asking deeper questions. Why am I constantly suffering just to keep this relationship alive? Why do I feel emotionally drained all the time? Why do I keep abandoning myself to protect someone who keeps hurting me? Those questions are signs that emotional separation has already begun. What is happening spiritually is extremely important. God is restoring emotional independence. Narcissistic relationships often create emotional dependency, where the empath feels responsible for the narcissist's happiness, emotions, reactions, and behavior. The empath becomes emotionally imprisoned by guilt, fear, obligation, and hope. But God begins breaking those invisible chains. He reminds the empath that they are not responsible for saving people who refuse to heal themselves. As the emotional separation grows, something powerful starts happening inside the empath. They slowly rediscover themselves. Their voice begins returning. Their confidence starts rebuilding. Their boundaries become stronger. They begin saying no without drowning in guilt. They stop over-explaining their feelings. They stop chasing temporary moments of affection after long periods of mistreatment. They start realizing that love should not require the destruction of self-respect. The narcissist often becomes more aggressive during this stage because they can sense the emotional control weakening. Manipulation may intensify. Gaslighting may increase. Sudden affection may appear unexpectedly. Why? Because narcissists often panic when they feel the empath emotionally slipping away. But by this point, God has already started opening the empath's eyes. What once looked like love now looks like control. What once looked like connection now looks like dependency. What once looked like loyalty now feels like emotional captivity. This process is painful because emotional separation feels like grieving someone while they are still physically present. The empath may cry, struggle internally, and feel confused about why their feelings are changing. But deep inside, God is protecting them from a future filled with greater emotional destruction. Sometimes heaven must disconnect your heart before your feet can finally walk away. And eventually the empath reaches a moment of clarity where they understand something life-changing. They were never losing love. They were losing emotional bondage. They realize that constantly suffering to keep someone close is not love. Real love brings growth, safety, honesty, peace, and mutual respect. Real love does not require one person to disappear so the other person can feel powerful. When God emotionally separates an empath from a narcissist, he is not trying to break the empath. He is trying to rebuild them. He is teaching them that their purpose is bigger than surviving toxic attachment. Their destiny is greater than begging for crumbs of affection. Their value is too precious to be buried under manipulation and emotional exhaustion. And once the empath fully heals, they begin to understand why God started the separation internally first. Because before God changes your environment, he changes your heart. Before he removes toxic people from your life, he removes the emotional chains that kept you connected to them. Only then can true freedom begin. One of the hardest experiences for an empath is the season of isolation that follows separation from a narcissist. It feels unnatural because empaths are deeply connected to people emotionally. They are nurturers by nature. They feel responsible for healing others, carrying burdens, solving emotional problems, and maintaining peace in relationships. So when God suddenly removes a narcissist from their life or allows the relationship to collapse, the silence that follows can feel unbearable. The empath often mistakes isolation for abandonment, when in reality it is one of the greatest forms of divine protection and restoration. You must understand that toxic relationships create emotional noise. There is constant confusion, emotional instability, manipulation, overthinking, guilt, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. The empath becomes so focused on surviving emotionally that they lose connection with themselves. They stop hearing their own voice clearly. They forget their dreams. They ignore their intuition. They suppress their needs. Over time, they become emotionally disconnected from their own identity because all their energy is being consumed by maintaining a relationship that constantly drains them. This is why God allows isolation. Not to punish the empath, but to separate them from the emotional noise that has been suffocating their spirit. Sometimes God removes every distraction so healing can finally begin. Because healing does not happen in chaos. Clarity does not grow in confusion. Restoration requires stillness. And many empaths never choose stillness on their own because they are addicted to fixing, rescuing, and emotionally attaching themselves to others. At first, isolation feels painful. The empath may sit alone questioning everything. They replay conversations in their mind. They wonder if they were too emotional, too sensitive, too patient, or not enough. They feel withdrawal because narcissistic relationships often create unhealthy emotional dependency. Even though the relationship was painful, the empath became accustomed to the cycle. Their emotions were trained to chase validation, affection, apologies, and temporary moments of peace. When the relationship ends, it can feel like losing a part of themselves. But this is where transformation begins. In isolation, the empath slowly starts reconnecting with their own mind, emotions, and spiritual awareness. For the first time in a long time, they are no longer reacting to manipulation every day. They are no longer walking on eggshells. They are no longer trying to predict someone's moods to avoid conflict. The nervous system slowly begins calming down. Their thoughts become clearer. Their emotions stabilize. And in that silence, God begins rebuilding the parts of them that were neglected for years. Isolation forces the empath to confront truths they avoided while distracted by the relationship. They begin realizing how much of themselves they sacrificed to keep another person comfortable. They see how often they ignored red flags. They understand how deeply they abandoned their own boundaries in order to preserve connection. This realization can be painful because empaths are usually compassionate toward others but harsh on themselves. Yet God uses this season to teach them that love without wisdom becomes self-destruction. During isolation, the empath also begins rediscovering forgotten parts of themselves. Dreams return, creativity returns, confidence slowly returns. They start enjoying peace instead of fearing it. They realize how emotionally exhausted they truly were. Many empaths only understand the depth of the damage after they leave the toxic environment, while inside the relationship, survival mode kept them blind. But distance creates perspective. Silence exposes what chaos tried to hide. This season also teaches the empath the difference between loneliness and peace. Before healing, they feared being alone because they believed attachment was necessary for happiness. But isolation reveals something powerful. Peace is more valuable than constant emotional drama. The empath begins enjoying moments of calm without guilt. They stop craving constant emotional stimulation. They stop confusing intensity with love. This is one of the greatest spiritual transformations that can happen after narcissistic abuse. And perhaps most importantly, isolation rebuilds identity. Narcissistic relationships slowly erase individuality. The empath becomes so focused on the narcissist's emotions, needs, and approval that they forget who they are outside the relationship. But when God separates them and places them in solitude, identity begins to return piece by piece. The empath remembers their value. They reconnect with their beliefs, passions, goals, and personal power. They stop defining themselves by how much they can endure for others. The beautiful truth is that isolation is temporary, but its lessons are permanent. God often isolates people before elevating them because broken identity cannot sustain a healthy future. Before the empath can enter healthier relationships, they must first learn emotional discipline, self-respect, discernment, and inner peace. Otherwise, they will continue repeating the same painful cycles with different people. Many empaths later look back and realize the isolation they once feared became the season that saved their life. It was the place where they stopped begging for love that hurt them. It was the place where they learned boundaries are not cruelty. It was the place where they discovered their worth does not depend on how much suffering they can tolerate. And most importantly, it was the place where they finally understood that God removed them from emotional captivity so they could become whole again. One of the greatest things God does when an empath and a narcissist are not destined to remain together is this. He redirects the empath away from emotional survival and toward divine purpose. This transformation does not happen overnight. In fact, it usually begins in pain, confusion, exhaustion, and emotional collapse. For a long time, the empath has been living in survival mode without even realizing it. Every day becomes about avoiding conflict, calming emotional chaos, fixing misunderstandings, managing moods, and trying to keep the relationship alive. Their entire emotional system becomes consumed with preserving peace in an environment that was never peaceful to begin with. The empath slowly loses sight of who they are because all their attention is focused on the narcissist's needs, reactions, emotions, and approval. They wake up thinking about the relationship. They sleep thinking about the relationship. Their happiness depends on temporary moments of validation. Their confidence rises and falls based on someone else's behavior. This is emotional captivity, and many empaths mistake it for love because they are naturally compassionate people. They believe endurance proves loyalty. They believe sacrifice proves devotion. But God never intended for love to become emotional imprisonment. So when God decides the connection is no longer part of the empath's destiny, he begins breaking the cycle. At first, the empath may resist the separation because they are emotionally attached to the hope of change. They remember the good moments. They hold on to potential. They convince themselves that if they love harder, stay longer, forgive more, or explain themselves better, things will improve. But God sees what the empath cannot fully see in that moment. He sees the future damage. He sees the emotional exhaustion ahead. He sees the years that could be wasted trying to heal someone who refuses accountability. This is why God allows the relationship to become uncomfortable. The emotional burden becomes heavier because heaven is trying to disconnect the empath from a place where they no longer belong. The empath begins feeling spiritually tired. Their joy decreases. Their inner peace disappears. Nothing feels stable anymore. But what feels like punishment is often divine redirection. God will sometimes allow emotional discomfort because comfort would keep you trapped somewhere your destiny cannot grow. Then comes the painful season of detachment. This is where the empath feels lost because the relationship that once consumed their life begins falling apart emotionally. They may cry constantly. They may question their worth. They may wonder why they were not enough. This stage is dangerous because many empaths are tempted to return simply to escape the pain of separation. But what they do not realize is that the pain is part of the healing process. God is not only removing a person, he is removing unhealthy emotional dependency. He is teaching the empath how to survive without constantly seeking validation from someone who kept them emotionally unstable. And slowly something begins to change. The empath starts hearing their own thoughts again. The emotional fog begins lifting. They start noticing how much energy they wasted trying to save a relationship that kept draining them. They begin rediscovering parts of themselves they abandoned. Their creativity returns. Their confidence slowly rebuilds. Their relationship with God deepens because pain often pushes people into spiritual awakening. They begin understanding that their value never depended on someone else's ability to appreciate them. This is where purpose begins awakening. The empath no longer wakes up consumed by emotional chaos. Instead, they begin focusing on growth, healing, discipline, wisdom, and calling. They start building the life they neglected while trying to fix someone else. Some discover hidden talents. Some pursue dreams they postponed for years. Some begin helping others heal because their suffering produced wisdom. What once felt like complete destruction becomes the foundation for transformation. And this is the powerful truth many people miss. The narcissist was never the center of the empath's destiny. They were only a chapter, not the final story. God never intended the empath to spend their entire life shrinking themselves to maintain toxic relationships. The separation was necessary because purpose cannot fully grow in environments built on manipulation and emotional confusion. When God redirects an empath toward purpose, he also changes their mindset. The empath becomes stronger emotionally and spiritually. They stop begging for bare minimum love. They stop chasing people who constantly make them prove their worth. They stop confusing emotional intensity with genuine connection. They learn the importance of boundaries, self-respect, discernment, and inner peace. Most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves for the comfort of others. Eventually, the empath reaches a moment where they no longer grieve the relationship the same way. They begin thanking God for the separation they once resisted. Why? Because they finally see the truth. The relationship was distracting them from becoming who they were created to be. Their destiny required freedom. Their calling required healing. Their future required clarity. And sometimes the greatest blessing God gives an empath is not the relationship they prayed would survive. Sometimes the greatest blessing is the relationship he refused to let continue. What feels like heartbreak is often divine redirection, but most people do not understand this truth while they are in the middle of emotional pain. When an empath loses a narcissist, it can feel like their entire world is collapsing. They question their worth, their judgment, their prayers, and sometimes even their faith. They wonder why they invested so much love only to receive confusion, manipulation, emotional exhaustion, and betrayal in return. The pain feels personal. The rejection feels deep. The silence feels unbearable. But what many empaths fail to realize is that God often removes people from your life, not because you are losing your value, but because you are finally being redirected toward your value. One of the most dangerous things an empath can do is mistake emotional attachment for divine assignment. Just because you deeply love someone does not mean they were sent to stay forever. Some people enter your life as lessons, warnings, awakenings, or temporary seasons. Yet empaths often hold on to toxic connections because they believe patience, sacrifice, and unconditional love will eventually transform the other person. They continue forgiving disrespect. They continue tolerating manipulation. They continue abandoning themselves emotionally in order to keep the relationship alive. But eventually God sees what the empath refuses to see. He sees the emotional destruction hidden behind the emotional attachment. And this is where heartbreak becomes divine redirection. God allows the collapse of the relationship because staying would have destroyed the empath's future even more than leaving ever could. Sometimes the breakup is not punishment. Sometimes it is protection. God knows that if the empath remains connected to the narcissist, they will continue shrinking emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and even physically. Their confidence will continue disappearing. Their peace will continue fading. Their purpose will remain buried underneath emotional chaos. So heaven intervenes. But divine redirection rarely feels comfortable in the beginning. It often feels painful because humans naturally grieve what they became emotionally attached to, even when it was unhealthy. That is why many empaths cry over people who repeatedly hurt them. Their heart became addicted to the cycle of hope, pain, affection, rejection, and temporary validation. They confuse emotional intensity with genuine love. Yet God understands something the empath does not yet fully understand. Real love should not require you to destroy yourself to keep it alive. There are moments when God will intentionally allow disappointment because disappointment becomes the doorway to awakening. If the narcissist had continued pretending forever, the empath may have stayed trapped for years. If the relationship remained temporarily comfortable, the empath might never have discovered the truth about themselves or the other person. So God allows exposure. He allows patterns to repeat until denial can no longer survive. He allows the empath to finally reach emotional exhaustion because sometimes people only change direction when staying the same becomes too painful. And this redirection is not only about removing the narcissist, it is also about restoring the empath. During the heartbreak, something deeper begins happening internally. The empath slowly starts reconnecting with themselves. They begin realizing how much of their identity was lost while trying to save someone else. They notice how often they ignored their intuition. They recognize how many boundaries they sacrificed just to avoid abandonment. And through this painful awakening, wisdom begins to grow. Many empaths discover their true strength only after the relationship ends. While they were inside the toxic cycle, they felt weak, confused, emotionally dependent, and spiritually drained. But separation forces growth. It forces reflection. It forces healing. The empath begins learning that their kindness was never weakness. Their compassion was never the problem. The real problem was giving sacred energy to someone committed to emotional destruction instead of emotional growth. What makes divine redirection so powerful is that it eventually leads the empath toward peace they never experienced inside the toxic relationship. At first, being alone feels terrifying. The silence feels strange because they became used to constant emotional drama. But slowly, peace becomes addictive. Clarity returns. Self-respect returns. Confidence returns. The empath starts sleeping better, thinking clearer, and breathing easier. They no longer wake up every day trying to earn love from someone emotionally unavailable. They stop carrying responsibility for another person's toxic behavior. They stop blaming themselves for things they never caused. And eventually the empath realizes something life-changing. The relationship ending was not the death of their future. It was the rescue of their future. What they once called heartbreak was actually heaven redirecting them away from emotional slavery. God was not removing love from their life. He was removing distraction, manipulation, confusion, and spiritual suffocation. Because sometimes the greatest blessing God can give you is the removal of someone you were too emotionally attached to release on your own. That is why you must never judge your life only by what ended. Sometimes the closed door is the evidence of divine mercy. Sometimes unanswered prayers are protection in disguise. Sometimes the relationship you cried over losing was the very thing blocking your growth, your healing, your calling, and your peace. And one day when you finally stand in emotional freedom, you will look back at the heartbreak that almost destroyed you and realize it was actually the moment God began saving your life.